Good morning and welcome to Wake Up to Broker Up with Mark, episode number 41 for 2025. The old adage, truth is stranger than fiction, still holds true a lot of times. I had the pleasure of being with Cheryl King, managing partner for Thomas & Brown and their director of education the other day, and she recanted a story that I thought was probably worth retelling to all of you. And that story had to do with the T&R and the buyer's decision to terminate before the buyer followed the proper procedures to terminate. And Thomas & Brown was the holder of the earnest money and had to make the unfortunate decision of releasing the earnest money to the seller instead of back to the buyer. So here's the way this worked. The seller had some type of a title issue that was either uncurable or the seller didn't want to spend the money or do what was necessary to cure the title issue. So with that, the attorney notified all parties that there was a title issue, and the buyer made a decision because they wanted their earnest money back and they wanted to move on to another property, since the seller emphatically said, "I'm not doing this." But of course that was coming through from the listing agent directly to the buyer's agent and then communicated to the buyer. And so the buyer made a decision that cost them their earnest money. And so the buyer decided to do a T&R in advance of anything else and put on there that there was a title issue and did a T&R and signed the upper and lower portion, and the lower portion with the earnest money coming back to the buyer. But unfortunately, the buyer didn't have that option. Whoops. You see where I'm going with this? So instead of the buyer getting their earnest money back and moving along, it went to the seller. Now, here's what should have happened there. There's a paragraph in there that talks about title. It's on page 2 of the purchase and sale agreement. And the buyer should have notified the seller in writing that there was a title issue, title objections as it is, and then they could have proceeded from there and followed the procedures outlined in the purchase and sale agreement to protect the buyer's earnest money. Unfortunately, the buyer jumped the gun, sent over the T&R, and the earnest money ultimately would be sent to the seller. Now, how do you avoid that? Well, if there's something strange going on, reach out to your broker. If it has to do with a T&R, sometimes, and most times, they probably are as clear-cut as they're just not following the procedures in the contract, meaning they're not signing, they're not doing this, they're not doing that, and usually the T&R is very clear-cut, buyer terminated prior to the end of due diligence as was required. Earnest money is going to come back to the buyer even though the seller's not going to sign it. Maybe have to do a 10-day letter, etc. But if there's something extraordinary happening, you need to make sure that you get input from your broker. You got to look at the whole picture. As Cheryl said, you can look at the contract, and when you can cite clearly what's going to happen, there's your answer. But if you can't find that language when you read it out loud, then that means that you need some extraordinary help, and you need to reach out to your brokers, and you need to make sure before you put the buyer's earnest money in jeopardy. In that case of the other one, the buyer had to follow the set procedures in the purchase and sale agreement, and what they probably should have done is she suggested have the seller send over a mutual termination, and then they could have signed it and the buyer's earnest money would be going back to the buyer. But instead, the buyer's agent jumped the gun, sent over a T&R, and you cannot unring that bell when it is rung. So therefore, the buyer's earnest money was put in jeopardy. Oops, oops, oops. Happens more than you know. Don't let it happen to you and anyone you're working with. Make sure that you're doing it correctly. Enjoy your day, enjoy your weekend. I hope you learned something today about earnest money and T&Ring too quickly. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.